This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Michelob Light Beer. Now here is Emery King.
Good evening. Right-wing army officers seized the Spanish parliament in a blaze of gunfire today and declared a military takeover. 350 members of parliament are apparently being held hostage. Soviet officials are speculating that President Leonid Brezhnev's call for a summit meeting with President Reagan may break the cycle of suspicion between the Kremlin and the administration. But at the White House, President Reagan was skeptical of Soviet motives. His press secretary Jim Brady warned it could be a ploy on the part of the Soviets. Banks nationwide cut their prime lending rates as low as 18.5% in response to a weakening in demand for business loans. I'm Emery King in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is an NBC News Update. I'm Stephanie Stanton. Here's what's making headlines at this hour. What happened in the Bush White House? Trains collide during rush hour, and a former CSI star headed to rehab. We begin in Washington, where current White House Press Secretary Dana Perino commented on former Secretary Scott McClellan's explosive tell-all book. Perino, who was a former deputy to McClellan, said that Scott is disgruntled about his experience at the White House, and this is not the Scott we knew. Now, the response was to McClellan's memoir, What Happened, that claims President Bush relied on propaganda instead of the truth to sell the Iraq War. It also says the Bush White House operated in a permanent campaign era. A frightening commute for passengers in a Boston suburb on Wednesday. Two trains collided when one train rear-ended another just as it started to move after stopping at a red signal. There are reports of at least one person taken to the hospital by medical helicopter. Several others suffered minor injuries. And in Chicago, two L-train cars derailed on the city's south side, injuring 14 people, none critically. Here in California, same-sex couples will be able to get a marriage license starting June 17th. The date was chosen because the state Supreme Court has until the end of business on June 16th to decide whether to grant a stay of its May ruling legalizing gay marriage. And finally, in Hollywood, former CSI star Gary Durden pled guilty to 2 counts of felony drug charges stemming from his April arrest. But the actor won't be spending any time behind bars. Instead, he's going to rehab. Once he finishes the program, the charges will be dropped. And that is the latest from NBC News. You can catch more on Today, anytime on MSNBC, and also right here. I'm Stephanie Stanton, NBC News, Los Angeles.
NBC News Update, sponsored by the automatic Olympus OM10. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. Pope John Paul II is in stable condition tonight following yesterday's assassination attempt. And Audrey of Buffalo, New York, also wounded by the gunfire in St. Peter's Square, is in serious condition. House and Senate budget writers agreed to a $695.3 billion package today. A compromise plan makes way for President Reagan's cuts in spending and in taxes. And House Republican leader Bob Michel talked taxes today, saying there are not enough votes in the House for a 30% across-the-board tax cut, but he is confident that a compromise plan can be reached. I'm Jessica Savage in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by New Era XX Solid Musk. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. A Kuwaiti newspaper says the Soviet Union has told the United States it would not honor any American blockade of Libya, and that it would use Soviet warships to keep the sea lanes open. 6 people filed affidavits in federal court today charging the federal government suppressed evidence that American prisoners of war are still being held in Indochina. The affidavits documented sightings of possible POWs, one as recently as last October. Now this.
Some people perspire.
We sweat. So for us, Era XX Solid.
With the great new musk scent, helps keep us extra
dry.
Well, finally, a baby killer whale born yesterday at San Diego SeaWorld is doing well. She weighs in at 350 pounds and is 7 feet long. And this baby hasn't even been named yet. Some baby. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Natural Light Beer. Now here is Susan Peterson.
Good evening. The Reagan administration tonight is reviewing the hostage agreement between the U.S. and Iran. The new administration says it intends to carry out the American obligations, but it may be considering other punitive measures. In Wiesbaden, the freed hostages continue to report cases of brutality and abuse during their captivity. But in Tehran, chief Iranian negotiator Narbavi denies that the 52 Americans were maltreated. Workers in Poland mounted their biggest strike in several months, shutting down more than 800 factories. The oil industry issued the first report on profit gains for 1980. Mobil had a 40% rise, and Ohio a 52% increase over profits the year before.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. The U.S. is sending more than 100 Marine and Air Force anti-terrorist experts to Panama. They'll guard the Panama Canal against possible sabotage. And this comes in a day of widespread protest against General Noriega's military rule. And veteran New Jersey Congressman Peter Rodino gave in to pressure from minority constituents and said he won't seek a 21st term. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Tom Brokaw, NBC News.
Good afternoon. In California, Theodore Streletsky was let out of prison today. He had served 5.5 years for killing his math professor at Stanford, but now he's right back in jail. He had threatened not to cooperate with his parole officers, and almost immediately he did not. And there's new trouble today for Edwin Meese's nomination as Attorney General. The Senate Judiciary Committee delayed its vote for a week to look into new evidence linking Meese to documents taken from Jimmy Carter's 1980 campaign. And finally, thousands of Polish students defied riot police and protested the government decision to remove crucifixes from their classrooms. I'm Tom Brokaw in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on the NBC Nightly News.
Good evening. Heavy rains fell again today on southeastern Arizona, where weekend floods left thousands homeless. 11 people are dead or missing. A teacher's strike in Chicago shut down the nation's third largest school system today. More than 400,000 students were affected. In Beirut, mortar fire sent U.S. Marines into foxholes near Beirut today. It was the heaviest fighting since the ceasefire halted Lebanon's civil war 8 days ago. And finally, the price of gold fell to its lowest closing level in a year in New York today. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. President Reagan has asked the Justice Department to check out the alleged use of Jimmy Carter's briefing papers by the Reagan side during the 1980 campaign debates. The long dominant Christian Democrats hold only a narrow lead over the communists in the Italian national elections, but are expected to win. The Supreme Court ruled today that states are allowed to tax multinational corporations on their worldwide profits. It means hundreds of millions in new state tax revenues. And the Space Shuttle Challenger starts home to Cape Canaveral tomorrow, bolted to a jumbo jet. The trip will take 2 days. I'm Linda Ellerby in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on NBC News overnight.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by American Airlines. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. Today a plane flew home carrying the bodies of 16 Americans killed in the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. And tonight, in a military ceremony, President Reagan honored the dead. In its Sunday edition, the Times of London has published passages alleged to be from Hitler's war diaries. More news after this.
Not getting to sit together when you fly? Next time, fly American Airlines and pre-reserve the seat you want.
A report by World Watch Institute of Washington says that by the year 2000, a quarter of the world's energy could come from renewable sources, such as the sun and the wind. And finally, jazz pianist Earl Father Hines died in California. He was 77. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Tom Brokaw, NBC News.
Good evening. President Reagan tonight denied any deal for the release of American hostages.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
The president did say the U.S. has been negotiating to restore relations with Iran, to end the Iran-Iraq war, to to eliminate state-supported terrorism and to get the hostages back. He said small amounts of arms were sent as a signal of his serious intentions. Now this.
Presenting Lipton Rice and Sauce Italiano from the side dish collection called Rice and Sauce with Vegetables. Lipton Rice and Sauce Italiano with that delicately seasoned taste.
The nation's Catholic bishops today called poverty in the U.S. a social and moral scandal and contrasted defense spending with the amount of money going to help the poor. I'm Tom Brokaw. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by American Express Card. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. 4 Arabs and West Germans blackmailed their hijacked Lufthansa 737 out of Dubai and into South Yemen. The 87 hostages are reported to be alive. West Germany still refuses to surrender 11 political prisoners the hijackers want freed. Cuban leader Fidel Castro got mixed reviews in Jamaica today. The leftist prime minister gave Castro a hero's medal. The opposition party called the Cubans' visit an insult. President Carter's church service was interrupted in Washington. 5 people protesting the neutron bomb were arrested on the church steps. And in Los Angeles, it was Dodgers 10, Yankees 4, and at least one more game to go in the World Series. I'm Linda Ellerby. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Somonix. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. National Guardsmen and state police recaptured the New Mexico State Prison near Santa Fe with no shooting. However, officials say at least 27 inmates died yesterday during the riot by 400 convicts. The head of the House Ethics Committee says it has also been investigating several congressmen the FBI says took bribes. According to a poll of New Hampshire Republican voters, George Bush is just ahead of Ronald Reagan as the presidential favorite. And Chief Justice Warren Burger spoke to the American Bar Association in Chicago. He permitted TV coverage of himself for the first time, and he chastised the nation's lawyers for charging such high prices. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update. Here is John Schubeck.
On the first full day following the Shah's departure from Iran, there was gunfire in the city of Avaz between pro-Shah troops and demonstrators. At least 30 people reported killed or wounded. One fireman is reported to have died tonight when a BART train caught fire in a tube beneath San Francisco Bay. Some riders suffered smoke inhalation. Mishap shut down the entire BART system. Police from Los Angeles have now gone to Bellingham, Washington, and questioned Kenneth Bianchi about the hillside stranglings, but the police had no comment. The new governor of Tennessee took office 3 days early today. Lamar Alexander sworn in to cut short the bizarre behavior of the outgoing governor, who has now freed several convicted murderers. John Wayne's general recovery from cancer surgery continues good. The doctors say additional cancer cells have now spread to the lymph nodes, possibly to John Wayne's entire body. John Schubeck, NBC News.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by American Express Traveler's Checks. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. One Israeli compared it to the landing of men on the moon. And if it was not that strange, it was close. In Jerusalem, the flag of Egypt and the flag of Israel, side by side. The president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and the prime minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, side by side. Speeches to the Israeli parliament, no specific concessions from either country. To many Israelis, Sadat was too tough. To many Arabs, he was not tough enough. Tonight, a working dinner. Tomorrow, a joint news conference. There is no agreement on peace in the Mideast tonight, but there is a hope and a historic meeting. And that in itself is more of a step toward peace than these two nations have seen in more than 30 years. I'm Linda Ellerby in Washington. More news later.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Ford. Here is Carol Simpson.
Good evening. President Carter and Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko exchanged sharp words during 4 hours of talks on limiting strategic arms, but Gromyko said they made some headway. 15,000 people attended a disarmament rally outside the UN in New York. They were protesting nuclear power. Dominican President Balaguer finally recognized his apparent successor Antonio Guzman by congratulating him for winning last week's election. Cleanup crews are trying to get rid of 85,000 gallons of oil which spilled into the Mobile River in Alabama. And gambling is in full swing in Atlantic City. The governor of Nevada wished New Jersey well and urged it to keep the gangsters out. Have a safe weekend. I'm Carol Simpson. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. Latin American foreign ministers and the United Nations Secretary General met today with Nicaragua's president. He gave them what he called a new peace proposal. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones average jumped almost 26 points to finish above 2,100 for the first time. As the nation honored the memory of Martin Luther King Jr. today, Atlanta civil rights leaders promised a new march in Georgia's all-white Forsyth County. And Alabama's Governor George Wallace retired from public life. Guy Hunt took over as the state's first Republican governor since Reconstruction days more than a century ago. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Ideal Toys. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. NASA tonight said the space shuttle could still fly its full 5-day mission despite problems with a fuel cell. But the Columbia is still on minimum mission status and scheduled to land Saturday. That's 3 days early. Budget Director David Stockman, quoted as critical of President Reagan's economic program, offered to resign today, but the president turned him down. Several major banks today cut their prime lending rate to 16.5%, the lowest it's been since last November. And Exxon today announced it was pulling out of Libya. Libya exports about 440,000 barrels of oil a day, and Exxon is responsible for about a quarter of this. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Capsule, sponsored by Arid XX Solid. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. James Lewis and his wife Leanne are still suspects in the Chicago Tylenol murders, but New York police said the couple was probably in Manhattan at the time of the murders. Lebanon's President Gemayel met today with French President Mitterrand and later said Mitterrand agrees on the need to expand the role of the international peacekeeping force in Lebanon. We'll have more in a moment.
Some people perspire. I sweat.
For you, the new Extra Strength Solid with Double X Protection. New Arid Double X Solid helps keep you extra dry.
Even me.
The gross national product barely went up in the third quarter, and economists say unemployment could hit 12% by next year. The stock market shrugged that off today and climbed more than 20 points, closing at its highest level in almost 10 years. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by American Express Cards. Here is
President Carter will meet with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat next Wednesday in Egypt. Today, the Egyptians toughen their terms for a Mideast peace, demanding that the Israelis withdraw their troops from both the West Bank of Jordan and the Gaza Strip and dismantle their settlements there. Mr. Carter is in Iran today, where he met with both King Hussein of Jordan and the Shah of Iran. The president agreed to sell Iran 6 to 8 nuclear reactors to generate electricity. Finally, during 1977, U.S. Customs agents seized narcotics with a street value of $866 million. I'm Douglas Kiker. If you're driving tonight, be careful. And Happy New Year, everybody.
This is NBC News Update. Here now is Bob Kerr.
Good evening. The American Cancer Society predicts 430,000 cancer deaths this year, more than 110,000 of them lung cancer. The Society's advice, stop smoking. Temperatures dropped to record lows all over the place today, the Midwest, the East, the South. Things will be better tomorrow, but not much. Economist Alan Greenspan says inflation will continue to go down, but unemployment will go up, close to 10%. He says the recession will be around for some time. And remember him, the Ayatollah Khomeini? He's holding a special reception this week to honor the militants who held Americans hostage in Iran. Bob Kerr in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Geritol. Here is John Dancy.
Good evening. Ayatollah Khomeini said today independent observers will be allowed to see the hostages in Tehran. White House spokesman Jody Powell said it's a step forward if the observers are truly independent, allowed to see all the hostages, and to take a doctor with them. President Carter presided over the lighting of 50 small Christmas trees in Washington today, but not the national Christmas tree. His reason?
We will turn on the other lights on the tree when the American hostages come home.
4 OPEC nations, including Saudi Arabia, raised their oil prices $6 a barrel today. In reaction, the price of gold rose $14 to close at $461 an ounce. I'm John Dancy in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Sominex. Here is Ford Rowan.
Good evening. Consumer prices are up again. In the past 11 years, prices have doubled. The dollar buys only half as much as it did in 1967. Romania and the Soviet Union are feuding over Romania's refusal to increase military spending. But there were denials tonight that ambassadors had been recalled as a protest. The former head of the U.S. Arms Control Agency, Paul Warnke, said a new SALT treaty with the Russians would do more to protect Americans than big civil defense evacuation plans. Attorney General Bell today proposed letting 15,000 more Vietnamese people who escaped their country by boat and have nowhere to go come to the United States. I'm Ford Rowan. More news later on this NBC station.
NBC Sunday Big Event continues following these messages. This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Lipton Tea Bags. Now here's Jessica Savage.
Good evening. Polish labor leaders tonight agreed to strike on Wednesday if the communist government does not agree to complete independence for their labor union. Ed Meese, chief advisor to Ronald Reagan, said the president-elect would take a serious view of a Soviet invasion of Poland. Ronald Reagan does not plan any direct involvement in foreign affairs until after inauguration. On domestic affairs, Howard Baker, the man likely to be Senate Majority Leader, said he favors a 10% tax cut by '81. And Voyager 1 is sending back pictures of Saturn and sounds like eerie screams. Scientists say that happens when solar winds strike the planet's magnetic field. I'm Jessica Savage in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by New Lipton Country Style Cup of Soup. Now here's Gene Pell.
Good evening. President-elect Reagan met with his top economic advisors today and said he will carry out campaign promises to cut taxes and reduce spending. Mr. Reagan flies to Washington tomorrow for meetings with President Carter and congressional leaders. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin has called on the U.S. to station troops in the Middle East to counter growing Soviet influence. At least 38 people are dead, hundreds injured after a munitions factory explosion in Bangkok, Thailand. And brush fires have scorched thousands of acres near Los Angeles, destroying scores of homes and forcing the evacuation of thousands of people. I'm Gene Pell in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.